15 years of devotion were distilled into the glass David handed me. It was our anniversary, and snow swirled outside our Chicago penthouse. But as the whiskey soured on my tongue, his phone lit up with a text that shattered my world. It read, "Did she drink it yet? We do not have much time." In that second, the loving husband opposite me vanished, replaced by a cold stranger calculating exactly how long it would take for me to die. My name is Sarah, and at 38 years old, I thought I was looking at the absolute peak of my life. The floor-to-ceiling windows of our Chicago penthouse offered a front-row seat to a blizzard that had been raging since noon. Thick white flakes swirled violently against the glass, sealing us inside a bubble of warmth and expensive silence. It was our 15th wedding anniversary. The city lights below were blurred smudges of gold and amber, distant and irrelevant. Up here, separated from the world by 40 floors of steel and concrete, it was just David and me, exactly how we liked it. The isolation usually felt romantic, like we were the only two people on Earth. But tonight, the snow piling up on the ledge looked less like a blanket and more like a wall. I turned my back on the storm to watch my husband. David stood behind the dark marble kitchen island, his sleeves rolled up to his elbows, revealing forearms that still looked as strong as they did when we met in college. He was preparing his signature whiskey sour with the focus of a surgeon. I loved watching him like this. He measured the lemon juice with exact precision, the ice clinking softly against the crystal shaker. There was a rhythm to his movements, a familiar comfort that had anchored me for a decade and a half. David was the steady one. While I tended to let my emotions drive, he was the navigator, always calm, always logical. That reliability was why he had climbed the ladder so quickly at Zenith Corp. He had been a senior director there for years, a pillar of stability who handled corporate crises with a disarming smile. He took care of everything, from the mortgage on this apartment to the small details like remembering to buy my favorite white tulips every spring. He was my rock. I had no reason to believe the ground beneath me was anything other than solid. He shook the mixture one last time, the sound sharp and rhythmic in the quiet room, before straining the golden liquid into 2 heavy lowball glasses. He garnished them with a maraschino cherry, just the way I liked, and walked over to me. His eyes were soft, filled with an emotion that looked like deep affection. He handed me the glass, his fingers brushing mine with a warmth that usually made me feel safe. "To the next 15 years. Sarah," he said, his voice low and smooth. "To a new chapter of our lives." I smiled, clinked my glass against his, and raised it to my lips. The first sip hit my tongue, and I frowned slightly behind the rim of the glass. It was tart, as expected, but there was an underlying bitterness that did not belong there. It tasted metallic, almost chemical, cutting through the sweetness of the simple syrup. I hesitated, but then I looked at David's expectant face. He was watching me closely, his own glass still untouched. He had probably just bought a different brand of rye, or maybe the lemons were particularly acidic this time of year. I forced myself to swallow, not wanting to ruin the mood by complaining about a drink he had made with such visible care. That was when the room seemed to tilt. David turned back to the counter to grab a cocktail napkin, leaving his phone face up on the marble surface right next to me. The screen illuminated the dim kitchen with a sudden, harsh, white light. A notification banner slid down from the top. I glanced down instinctively. The contact name read, Valerie, Insurance Advisor. I felt a flicker of confusion because it was 9 at night on a Friday, hardly the time for standard insurance queries. Then I read the preview text that hovered there for a split second before the screen went dark again. It read, "Did she drink it yet? Double dose. Be careful." My heart hammered against my ribs so hard I thought David might hear it. The world narrowed down to that black screen. Double dose. The bitter taste in my mouth suddenly felt like fire. Panic clawed at my throat, urging me to scream, to ask him what the hell that meant, but a primal instinct slammed the brakes on my reaction. If I screamed, I was trapped in a penthouse 40 floors up with a man who wanted me dead. David turned back around, napkin in hand, smiling that same warm, terrifying smile. I forced my body to move. I convulsed forward, feigning a violent coughing fit. My hand jerked intentionally, and I flung the contents of the heavy crystal glass directly into the soil of the large potted fiddle leaf fig beside me. David dropped to his knees beside the planter with a speed that was almost violent. He did not ask if I was okay. He did not pat my back or offer me water. Instead, his eyes darted frantically between the empty crystal glass in my hand and the dark stain spreading across the soil of the fiddle leaf fig. He grabbed a towel from the counter and began dabbing at the leaves, but his focus was clearly elsewhere. He turned to me, his face pale, and asked how much I had swallowed. His voice was tight, pitched higher than usual. He was not worried about my coughing fit. He was calculating the dosage. He needed to know if enough of the poison had entered my system to do whatever job it was meant to do. I stumbled back against the refrigerator, clutching my throat with one hand while the other gripped the countertop for support. The room was not actually spinning, but I needed him to believe it was. I told him that the drink was too strong and that I felt suddenly lightheaded. I lied and said the alcohol had hit me instantly. I told him I needed to lie down right now, without waiting for his response. I turned and fled toward the hallway. I could feel his eyes boring into my back, assessing my gait, looking for the first signs of weakness. Once inside the master bedroom, I locked the door to the ensuite bathroom and turned on the faucet to mask any sound. I fell to my knees in front of the toilet. I jammed 2 fingers down my throat, gagging until my body convulsed. I forced myself to retch until I tasted the bitter bile and the remnants of the whiskey sour. I flushed the toilet and splashed cold water on my face, staring at my reflection. My eyes looked terrified, wide and wild. I had to calm down. I had to be an actress. The man in the kitchen was not my husband anymore. He was a predator, and I was prey trapped in a penthouse cage. I unlocked the bathroom door and crawled into bed just as David entered the room. He sat on the edge of the mattress and pulled the duvet up to my chin. His hand rested on my forehead, checking my temperature. To anyone else, it would have looked like a tender gesture from a loving spouse. But I saw the clinical detachment in his gaze. He was not comforting me. He was inspecting a lab rat. He asked if my vision was blurry. He asked if my heart was racing. I lied and told him I just felt incredibly tired. He stroked my hair, told me to sleep it off, and said he would clean up the mess in the kitchen. I lay there for hours, regulating my breathing to mimic deep sleep. My body was rigid with adrenaline, but I forced my limbs to remain heavy and limp. Through the open door, I heard his pacing in the living room. It was a frantic, heavy rhythm. Then came the low murmur of his voice. I strained my ears against the silence of the snow-muffled city. He was whispering aggressively. I heard him say that I had spilled most of it. He sounded desperate, arguing that he could not force another drink on me without raising suspicion. It was nearly 3 in the morning when he finally came to bed. I waited another hour until his breathing shifted into the deep, rhythmic snoring I had known for 15 years. My heart was pounding so hard I feared it would wake him. I sat up inches at a time. His phone was on the nightstand, charging. I knew the passcode was his birthday, but he might have changed it if he was hiding something this big. I decided to take the riskier but surer path. I gently lifted his heavy hand. He stirred slightly, and I froze, holding my breath until his breathing leveled out again. I pressed his thumb against the sensor. The screen unlocked. I navigated immediately to his messages. The thread with Valerie was at the top. I scrolled up, and the air left my lungs. Valerie was not an insurance advisor. Based on the jargon in the texts, she was a pharmacist, someone he knew from his volunteer days at the city hospital. The conversation was a cold-blooded blueprint for my destruction. They were not planning to kill me outright. That would be too messy and trigger a police investigation. The plan was far more sinister. The drug was a combination of scopolamine and a high-grade antipsychotic meant to induce hallucinations, paranoia, and erratic behavior. I read the texts with trembling hands. The goal was to stage a psychotic break. David would document my descent into madness over the weekend. By Monday, he planned to have me involuntarily committed to a private psychiatric facility where Valerie had connections. Once I was declared mentally incompetent, David would gain power of attorney over my assets, including the inheritance my grandmother had left me last year. He was not just trying to end my life. He was trying to erase who I was, locking me away in a padded room while he spent my money. I looked at the sleeping man beside me, the man who had vowed to protect me, and realized I was sleeping next to a monster. The morning sun hit the snow-blind windows, but I kept the blackout curtains drawn to maintain the illusion of a sick room. I needed to play the part of the deteriorating wife perfectly. When David shook me gently at 7 in the morning, asking how I felt, I let my eyelids flutter and pitched my voice into a slur. I told him my head felt heavy and my thoughts were foggy. He looked satisfied, masked as concern, and kissed my forehead. He told me to rest while he went to the office to handle a client crisis. The moment the elevator doors slid shut and the lock clicked, I threw off the duvet. The grieving, confused wife vanished, and in her place stood a cold, methodical investigator. I sat at his mahogany desk and dialed the general inquiry line for Zenith Corp. I put on my best worried spouse voice and asked for the benefits coordinator, claiming I needed to verify our health insurance coverage for an urgent procedure. There was a long pause on the other end. The woman's voice became awkward. She told me that David was no longer an employee there. I pressed her, my heart rate steady despite the shock. She hesitated before admitting he had been terminated 8 months ago for financial irregularities. Embezzlement. He had been dressing up in a suit and pretending to go to work for nearly a year, lying to my face every single morning. I logged into our joint bank account immediately. The balance was healthy, sitting at $50,000. It was a decoy, a stage prop to keep me complacent. I navigated to the credit bureaus and requested a full credit report for David, using his social security number and the answers to his security questions, which I knew by heart. The screen filled with red flags. It was a financial catastrophe. There were inquiries from high-risk lenders and short-term loan sharks. He had taken out hundreds of thousands of dollars in loans with exorbitant interest rates. He was drowning in debt, and the sharks were circling closer every day. Then I found the exit strategy. I dug through a hidden folder on his cloud drive named Tax Documents. Inside, I found a PDF downloaded 2 weeks ago. It was a newly instated life insurance policy on me, along with a specific rider for permanent disability. The payout was staggering. It was set for $5 million. The terms were specific. If I were declared mentally incompetent or died, the beneficiary was David alone. I stared at the screen, feeling a chill that had nothing to do with the snow outside. I was not a wife to him anymore. I was a $5 million lottery ticket waiting to be cashed. I moved quickly, driven by a cold rage. I retrieved the spy cameras I had bought years ago to monitor a dog sitter we never ended up hiring. They were small, magnetic, and connected to my phone. I stuck one under the lip of the kitchen island, pointing directly at where he mixed drinks. I hid another on the bookshelf in his office, wedged between 2 thick law encyclopedias. I activated the audio recording on both. If he spoke to Valerie again, I would hear every word. I returned to the crime scene in the kitchen. The fiddle leaf fig looked darker where I had dumped the whiskey sour. I used a metal spoon to scrape the top layer of the saturated soil into a plastic bag. I double-bagged it and labeled it with the date. I had a contact at a private toxicology lab from my days working in corporate law litigation. I ordered a courier to pick it up within the hour for a rush analysis. I needed scientific proof of what exactly he was trying to put inside my body. As I sealed the bag, my hand spasmed violently. The plastic baggie slipped from my fingers and hit the floor. I stared at my hand. It was trembling uncontrollably. I blinked, and for a second, the white tiles of the kitchen floor seemed to breathe, expanding and contracting like a lung. Panic flared in my chest. I had only taken a tiny sip, barely enough to wet my throat, and yet the chemicals were already warping my perception. If I had finished that glass, my mind would have been shattered by now. I drank a glass of water, forcing myself to focus on the cold sensation to ground myself. The rational part of my brain told me to call the police. I had enough for probable cause, but I hesitated. If I called them now, David might lawyer up. He might spin a story about my mental health, using the very symptoms he caused against me. And there was Valerie. She was the puppeteer pulling the strings, or at least a willing accomplice. I needed to know who she was and why David needed $5 million so desperately that he would murder the woman he had slept beside for 15 years. I needed the full picture before I brought the hammer down. I opened the tracking app on my phone, watching the small blue dot that represented David's car moving away from the city center. He wasn't heading toward the financial district where Zenith Corp was located. Instead, he was driving west, deep into the suburbs. The dot finally stopped in a neighborhood I didn't recognize, a cluster of dilapidated apartment complexes miles away from our pristine life. I zoomed in on the map. It was a rundown area known for cheap rents and high crime rates. Why was my husband, a man who complained if his espresso wasn't the right temperature, visiting a place like that? While he was parked, I contacted a private investigator I had used once for a corporate background check. I gave him the name Valerie and the phone number I had memorized from David's screen. Within 2 hours, the dossier hit my inbox. Valerie wasn't just a random pharmacist. She was David's ex-girlfriend from college, a relationship I never knew existed. The report painted a grim picture. She was drowning in debt, most of it from online gambling sites. She owed nearly $80,000 to creditors who didn't seem like the type to send polite letters. Then came the notification from the toxicology lab. I opened the email, my stomach tightening. The soil sample from the fiddle leaf fig was a chemical cocktail. It tested positive for high concentrations of scopolamine and a potent antipsychotic drug usually reserved for severe schizophrenia. The lab tech had added a note in bold warning. This combination induces compliance, memory loss, and hallucinations. Extended exposure can cause permanent cognitive damage. I wasn't just being poisoned, I was being chemically lobotomized. David wanted a wife who would sign papers without reading them and then drool in a corner while he spent her money. My phone buzzed again. It was a video file from the investigator. He had tailed David to a diner near the apartment complex. The grainy footage showed David sitting in a booth across from a woman with sharp features and tired eyes, Valerie. They weren't holding hands or sharing lovers' glances. They were arguing. David looked frantic, his hands chopping the air, while Valerie looked cold and unimpressed. Then, I saw it. David slid a thick envelope across the table. Valerie didn't put it in her purse. She stood up, walked to the diner entrance, and handed the envelope directly to a man in a leather jacket waiting by the door. He took it without a word and left. The pieces shifted in my mind. Valerie wasn't the mastermind. She was the middleman. She wasn't keeping the money. She was paying someone else. But who and for what? The gambling debt explained her desperation. But it didn't explain why David was so terrified. He wasn't just helping an old flame. He was paying off a debt that looked dangerous. The front door lock clicked. I quickly closed the laptop and hurried to the living room, assuming my position on the sofa. David walked in, shaking snow from his coat. He looked exhausted, dark circles under his eyes, but he forced a smile when he saw me. He held up a gold box of artisanal chocolates. "Thought you could use a pick-me-up," he said, his voice sickeningly sweet. "These are the sea salt caramels you love." I took the box, my fingers brushing his. I knew with absolute certainty that every single chocolate in that box was laced with the same chemical nightmare he had put in my drink. "Thank you, darling," I said, my voice weak. "You're so good to me." I waited until he went to the bathroom to wash up. I quickly took 2 chocolates, crumbled them into a tissue, and flushed them down the toilet. When he returned, I was wiping chocolate from the corner of my mouth. "They're delicious," I murmured, letting my eyes drift out of focus. But did we pay the electric bill? The lights. They look like they're breathing. David stopped drying his hands. He stared at me, a predator watching the trap spring shut. The lights are fine, Sarah, he said softly. You're just tired. Maybe you should have another one. I can't remember. I trailed off, looking around the room with feigned confusion. What is that thing? The thing you sit on? A chair, he asked, stepping closer. Yes, I whispered, pressing my hands to my temples. A chair. Why couldn't I remember the word for chair? I saw the tension leave his shoulders. He believed it. He thought my mind was finally breaking. He sat next to me, putting a comforting arm around my shoulders, but I could feel the cold calculation radiating off him. It's okay, he soothed. Just relax. I'm here to take care of everything. The camera on his phone was barely concealed. Every time I stuttered or stared blankly at a wall, David would casually lift his device, pretending to text while the lens captured my decline. He was building his portfolio of evidence, a digital scrapbook of my insanity to show the doctors. I gave him exactly what he wanted. I wept over a spilled glass of water. I asked him if the cat we never owned had been fed. I watched him suppress a smirk as he hit record, confident that he was the director of this play. He didn't realize I had already rewritten the script. While he was in the shower, reveling in his apparent success, I slipped into the kitchen. David had a ritual. Every night before bed, he took a mild sedative to help him sleep. And every morning, he drank a double-shot espresso. I opened his pill bottle, dumped out the sedatives, and replaced them with identical-looking vitamin D tablets. Then, I took the chocolates he had given me, the ones laced with scopolamine, and dissolved 2 of them into his bag of premium coffee grounds. He wanted madness. I would serve it to him in his favorite mug. The effects started by mid-morning on Saturday. David sat at the kitchen island, gripping his coffee cup, blinking rapidly. He rubbed his temples, muttering about a headache. Then came the twitching. His hand jerked, spilling hot coffee onto the counter. I watched from the living room, sipping my own safe tea, my face a mask of vacant confusion. "Are you okay, David?" I asked, my voice dreamy and detached. "I'm fine," he snapped, but his eyes were darting around the room, chasing shadows that weren't there. Just tired. "The light in here is weird today." By noon, the facade was cracking. He was pacing the hallway, sweating despite the thermostat being set to 70 degrees. The drug was loosening his tongue, stripping away his carefully constructed filters. He slumped onto the sofa, head in his hands, and began to mumble. I crept closer, my phone's recorder running silently in my pocket. "St. Jude," he whispered, his voice thick. "The hospital. They need the money by Friday. She can't wait." "Who can't wait?" "David," I asked softly, leaning in. "The baby," he slurred, looking right through me. "Lily. My poor Lily. Lily." The name hit me like a physical blow. We didn't have children. We had tried for years before deciding we were happy just being us. Or so I thought. While he drifted into a drug-induced stupor on the couch, I took his keys and went down to the garage. I needed to find whatever he was hiding that didn't fit on a phone screen. I went straight to his workbench. Behind a heavy tool chest, tucked into a crawl space I didn't know existed, was a metal lockbox. I smashed the lock with a hammer. Inside wasn't cash or drugs. It was a birth certificate. Lily Harper, 12 years old. The father's name was David Harper. The mother was a woman named Elena Ross. The date of birth was 3 years into our marriage. He hadn't just cheated. He had built an entire parallel life. Beneath the birth certificate was a stack of medical bills from St. Jude Children's Research Hospital. The diagnosis was terminal without intervention, hypoplastic left heart syndrome. She needed a transplant and specialized care that insurance wouldn't cover. The cost was astronomical. Then I found the connection. A photo of Elena Ross and Valerie together, arms around each other. looking like sisters. I turned the photo over. Cousins Forever, 2010, was scrawled on the back. The narrative shifted violently. Valerie wasn't a blackmailer in the traditional sense. She was family. She was desperate to save her dying niece. And she was using David's embezzlement, which she must have discovered or helped facilitate, as leverage. Save the girl, or go to prison. David was trapped between a dying daughter he loved and a wife he had to sacrifice to pay the bill. He wasn't killing me out of hatred. He was killing me out of love for someone else. I drove to the hospital with the copy of the birth certificate burning a hole in my bag. St. Jude was a place of quiet miracles and devastating realities. I found room 304 and stood in the doorway, my breath catching in my throat. There she was, Lily. She was frail, her skin translucent against the stark white sheets, hooked up to machines that beeped in a rhythmic, terrifying cadence. But it was her eyes that stopped me cold. They were David's eyes, the same shape, the same hazel color, staring out from a face that should have been full of life but was etched with exhaustion. A woman stood by the window, arranging cheap supermarket flowers in a plastic cup. This had to be Elena. She turned when she saw me, wiping her hands on jeans that had seen better days. She looked nothing like me. She was worn down by life, her hair pulled back in a messy bun, her face free of makeup but full of a gentle, weary kindness. She asked if I was a new specialist. I lied effortlessly. I told her I was a volunteer with the hospital support network, just checking in on families. We talked for 10 minutes. In that short time, she dismantled my entire understanding of my marriage. She told me about Lily's father, a man she described as a saint. She said he was currently working double shifts in another state, traveling constantly to scrape together the money for Lily's heart surgery. She said he was exhausted but never complained. She had no idea he was a senior director at a major corporation. She had no idea he lived in a penthouse with a wife of 15 years. To her, he was just a struggling, loving father doing whatever it took to save their little girl. I walked out of that room feeling like I had been punched in the gut. The villain in my story was the hero in theirs. David was not killing me out of malice or greed in the traditional sense. He was killing me because he had weighed my life against his daughter's, and I had lost. He was a desperate father willing to become a monster to keep his child's heart beating. It was a motive so pure it was terrifying, but as I drove back to the city, the sympathy hardened into ice. I understood him, but I could not forgive him. He had made a choice. He had decided that my life was the currency he would use to pay his debts. He had looked at me, held my hand, and planned my destruction while smiling. I was not a check to be cashed. I was a living, breathing woman, and I refused to be the collateral damage in his tragedy. I returned to the apartment just as the sun was setting. David was still groggy from the drugs I had slipped him, dozing on the sofa. His phone buzzed on the coffee table. I picked it up, shielding the screen from his line of sight. It was a message from Valerie. The text was short and brutal. It read, "Tonight has to be the end. If she is not gone by morning, and if that money is not secured for the surgery next week, I am sending the embezzlement files to the police. I am sorry, David, but I am choosing Lily." I placed the phone back down exactly as I found it. The deadline was set. There would be no more slow poisoning. Tonight. He would try to finish it. I looked at my husband, the father of the dying girl, and felt the last trace of love evaporate. He was fighting for his family, but so was I. The only difference was that my family was just me. I set the dining room table with the same bone china and crystal glasses we had used 3 nights ago. I wanted the stage to be identical to the crime scene. I spent the afternoon cooking David's favorite meal, a rosemary-crusted lamb rack, moving around the kitchen with a terrifying sense of calm. When David woke up from his nap, still groggy from the withdrawal of the sedatives I had withheld and the residual effects of the hallucinogens I had given him, I played my final card. I told him that I could feel my mind slipping away again. I told him I was terrified of being declared incompetent by the state and losing control of my grandmother's inheritance. I suggested that we bring his insurance advisor, Valerie, over tonight so I could sign the power of attorney documents while I still had a moment of clarity. David looked at me with a mixture of shock and profound relief. He believed the drugs were working exactly as Valerie had promised. He thought I was pliable, confused, and ready to hand over my life. He agreed immediately, his hands shaking as he dialed her number. He thought he was about to cross the finish line. He had no idea he was inviting his accomplice into a cage I had already locked. While David was in the shower trying to make himself look presentable, I made 2 phone calls. The first was to my lawyer, instructing him to be on standby on video call. The second was to the detective from the Grand Larceny Division who had been building a case against David for months. I told them I had the primary suspect, his accomplice, and a taped confession incoming. They were now parked in an unmarked van down the street, waiting for my signal. I walked to the sideboard and checked my own folder. Inside was a certified blood test I had taken that morning at a private clinic, proving my system was clean of any narcotics. It contradicted the narrative David was planning to sell to the courts. I was not the crazy wife. I was the most sane person in the building. The doorbell rang at 7 o'clock sharp. Valerie walked in, bringing a gust of cold air with her. She looked exactly like her photo, sharp-featured and intense, but there was a tightness around her eyes that betrayed her desperation. She wore a business suit that looked expensive but was fraying slightly at the cuffs. She was a woman on the edge, just like David. David greeted her with a stiff nod. He looked terrible, his skin gray and his eyes bloodshot. The guilt and the chemicals were eating him alive from the inside out. I played the perfect hostess. I guided them to the table and moved to the bar cart. This time, I was the one mixing the drinks. I poured 3 glasses of scotch. Neat. No mixers. No hidden powders. I wanted them crystal clear for what was about to happen. I set the glasses down and took my seat at the head of the table, facing them both. "We should toast," I said, raising my glass. Valerie looked impatient. She placed a thick stack of legal documents on the table and pushed a pen toward me. "She told me that we really should get the paperwork out of the way first so I could rest." Her voice was clipped and professional, masking the fact that she was coercing a woman she believed to be mentally unstable. I ignored the pen. I looked at David and smiled. A genuine, sad smile. I asked him if he remembered our honeymoon in Tuscany. I reminded him of the promise he made to always keep me safe. I saw him flinch. He looked down at his drink, unable to meet my gaze. The shame was radiating off him in waves. Valerie snapped. She slammed her hand on the table, rattling the silverware. She said we did not have time for nostalgia and that I needed to sign the papers immediately. I looked at her coldly, dropping the act of the confused victim. I reached under the table and pulled out a thick manila folder, but it was not the power of attorney paperwork. I slammed it down on top of her documents. The cover fell open, revealing the logo of St. Jude Children's Research Hospital and a photo of a 12-year-old girl with hazel eyes. "I am not signing anything," I said, my voice steady and hard. "But I think we should talk about Lily." The silence in the room was absolute. David stared at the file as if it were a bomb. Valerie's face drained of all color, her eyes fixed on the photo of her niece. The arrogant, professional mask she had worn since entering my home shattered instantly. "How did you find this?" David asked, his voice barely a whisper. "I know everything, David," I said, my voice cutting through the air like glass. "I know about Zenith Corp firing you 8 months ago for embezzlement. I know about the loan sharks. I know about the $5 million insurance policy you took out on my life. And I know about the scopolamine in my whiskey sour." David looked up, his eyes wide with terror. He started to beg, calling my name, but I cut him off. "Do not speak," I snapped. "You stood in this kitchen, on our anniversary, and handed me a glass of poison. You were going to have me committed. You were going to erase me. David. Just so you could cash a check. David crumbled. He did not just sit down, he collapsed onto the floor, grabbing the edge of the tablecloth. He was sobbing, a raw, ugly sound that echoed in the large room. He screamed that he did not have a choice. He told me Lily was dying. He said her heart was failing and he had no money left. He said they were going to let her die. So you decided I had to die instead. I asked, feeling a cold fire in my chest. I was desperate. He wailed, reaching out to touch my leg, but I pulled back. I tried everything else. I borrowed. I stole. I begged. This was the only way to get the surgery money in time. I did not want to hurt you, but I could not let my little girl die. Shut up, Valerie screamed. She was not looking at David. She was looking at my phone, which was sitting face up on the table. Her eyes were wild. She hissed that I knew too much and they could not fix this if I talked. Valerie lunged across the table. She was fast, fueled by panic and adrenaline. She grabbed for my phone, her fingernails scraping against the screen. But she underestimated me. She thought I was the soft, pampered wife from the penthouse. She did not know I had spent 3 years taking Krav Maga classes after a scare in the parking garage at my old firm. As she scrambled over the table, knocking over the Scotch glasses, I stood up and sidestepped. I grabbed her wrist, used her momentum against her, and twisted. She yelped in pain as I slammed her arm behind her back and shoved her face first into the wall. I held her there, pinning her easily. "Do not move," I warned, tightening my grip. "And for the record, you are not just fighting me. You are performing for an audience." I nodded toward the phone. I told them I had been live streaming this entire conversation to my lawyer and the private investigator parked outside. I told them every word they said, every threat, every confession was recorded on a cloud server they could not touch. Valerie went limp in my grip. The fight drained out of her instantly. David looked up from the floor, his face streaked with tears, realizing the finality of what I had said. "Sarah," David choked out, "I love you. You have to believe that. I love you so much. You love me." I scoffed, releasing Valerie and stepping back so I could see them both. "You love me, yet you spent weeks planning how to drive me insane. You watched me drink that poison and you hoped I would swallow it all. It was for Lily," he whispered, as if that name was a magic spell that absolved him of all sins. A father would do anything for his child. Anything. It made me crazy. It turned me into someone I do not know, but I never stopped loving you. I looked at him, really looked at him, for the last time. I saw the man I had built a life with, and I saw the monster who had tried to end it. They were the same person. That was the tragedy. "I have one question. David," I said quietly. "If I had finished that drink, and if the plan had worked and I had died in some cold institution, alone and terrified, would you have been heartbroken?" David looked me in the eye, his expression full of genuine, agonizing grief. He told me yes. He said it would have destroyed him. He said he would have mourned me every single day for the rest of his life. "I believe you," I said, "but your grief does not save my life, and it does not forgive you." The front door did not open. It exploded inward. The heavy oak panels splintered under the force of the battering ram, and suddenly the hallway was flooded with uniformed officers and plainclothes detectives. The sound was deafening, a cacophony of shouted commands that bounced off the marble floors. David did not run. He did not even stand up. He remained on his knees, his hands raised slowly above his head, tears streaming down his face. He looked small, defeated, and utterly pathetic. Valerie, on the other hand, unraveled completely. When the officers grabbed her arms, she began to shriek. She screamed that she was innocent, that David was a psychopath who had forced her into this. She pointed a shaking finger at him, accusing him of being the mastermind. But the detective who cuffed her just shook his head. They had the text logs. They knew she was the one who procured the scopolamine. They knew she was the one pushing for the lethal dose. She was not a victim. She was the architect of the murder weapon. As they hauled David to his feet, he stopped resisting. He turned his head to look at me one last time. His eyes were hollow. "Sarah, please," he choked out. "Hate me. Destroy me. I deserve it. But please do not take it out on her. Lily is innocent. Please, just have mercy on the child." I said nothing. I stood like a statue by the window, watching the red and blue lights of the police cruisers pulse against the snowy night. I watched my husband of 15 years get shoved into the back of a squad car. The penthouse, once my sanctuary, was now swarming with evidence technicians dusting for fingerprints and photographing the unwashed glasses. It felt cold, violated, and dead. The next week was a blur of depositions, interviews, and flashing camera bulbs. The press ate it up. The wealthy executive, the secret family, the plot to drive his wife mad. It was headlines everywhere. But the real blow came during a meeting with my forensic accountant. David had not just emptied his own accounts. He had forged my signature to take out a second mortgage on the penthouse. He had leveraged our home to the hilt to pay off gambling debts and medical bills. If I had not discovered the plot when I did, the bank would have foreclosed within the month. I would have been institutionalized, and I would have woken up homeless. Then came the knock on the door that I was dreading. The doorman told me a woman named Elena Ross was in the lobby, refusing to leave until she saw me. I told him to send her up. Elena looked even more fragile than she had at the hospital. She walked into the living room and immediately dropped to her knees on the hard floor. She was weeping, her whole body shaking with sobs. She apologized over and over again. She told me she had no idea about me, about the money, about the poison. She thought David was a traveling consultant. She thought the money was coming from loans he was working overtime to pay off. I looked down at this woman. She was the mother of the child my husband loved enough to kill for. She was humiliated, broken, and terrified. "We will go," she sobbed, hiding her face in her hands. "I will take Lily, and we will disappear. You will never see us again. I am so sorry. I am so sorry." She stood up to leave, stumbling toward the door, accepting that her daughter was going to die because the money for the surgery was gone. The police had seized David's assets. There was nothing left. I stood there in the center of my empty, silent home. I held the power of life and death in my hands, just like David had held that glass of whiskey. I could let them walk out the door. It would be justice. It would be fair. Why should I save the child of the man who tried to destroy me? But then I remembered Lily's eyes. They were David's eyes. Yes. But they were also the eyes of a 12-year-old girl who had never hurt anyone. I had to decide if I was going to be the victim who survived or the woman who rose above the wreckage. I put the penthouse on the market the very next day. I did not care about getting the best price or negotiating with buyers. I just wanted it gone. I sold it for under market value to a young tech entrepreneur who thought the view was inspiring. To me, that view was just a reminder of the cage I had almost died in. I sold everything else too: the furniture, the art, the crystal glasses, and every single suit hanging in David's closet. I scrubbed my life clean of his existence. I refused to live in a museum of my own betrayal. The sale of the apartment cleared the mortgage debt David had secretly accrued, and there was a significant sum left over. I took a check for $300,000 and walked into the offices of a medical charity foundation. I established an anonymous grant specifically designated for the immediate surgical costs of a pediatric patient named Lily Harper at St. Jude. I made the terms absolute. The donor was to remain nameless forever. I did not do it for David, and I certainly did not do it for Elena. I did it because a 12-year-old girl should not have to pay the price for her father's sins with her life. I wanted her to live, but I wanted absolutely nothing to do with her. I saved her, and then I walked away. The legal process was swift and brutal. With my testimony and the recordings, there was no wiggle room for a plea deal. The judge sentenced David to 15 years in a federal penitentiary for attempted murder, fraud, and embezzlement. I sat in the back of the courtroom when the gavel came down. He turned to look at me, his eyes searching for some sign of forgiveness, perhaps a hope that I would visit him. I gave him nothing. I stood up and walked out of the courthouse without looking back. I never visited. I never wrote a letter. I never sent money for his commissary. He was dead to me. Valerie received 10 years for conspiracy and distribution of controlled substances. They had plenty of time to think about the money they never got. I moved to a small coastal town in Oregon, a place where the rain washed everything clean. I used the rest of my savings to lease a small storefront near the pier. I opened a bakery called the Second Crumb. It was the kind of dream David used to mock, calling it a cute hobby that would never turn a real profit. He was wrong. The bakery was thriving. The physical work of kneading dough and carrying flour sacks grounded me. It was honest work, and it healed me in ways that therapy never could. 6 months after I opened, I received a forward from the Charity Foundation. It was a thick envelope. Inside was a crayon drawing of a bright red heart with a smiley face and the words, "Thank you," written in shaky block letters. It was from Lily. I stared at it for a long time, tracing the lines with my flour-dusted finger. I felt a quiet peace settle in my chest. I took the drawing to the back alley where I burned the trash. I struck a match and watched the paper curl into ash. I did not need a souvenir. I did not need a connection. Knowing she was breathing was enough. That evening, I sat in the front of my shop, watching the sun dip below the horizon. I poured myself a glass of fresh orange juice. No whiskey. No sour mix, just something sweet and simple. I raised the glass to the empty room. To Sarah, I whispered. To surviving. My phone screen lit up on the counter. For a fraction of a second, my heart jumped, a phantom reflex from that night in Chicago. I looked down. It was a text from a woman I had met at the local library, asking if I wanted to go for a walk on the beach tomorrow. I smiled, typed back a yes, and turned off the lights. I was finally free. Thank you so much for listening to this story. Please comment below and let me know where you are listening from. I would love to hear your thoughts and connect with you all. Don't forget to subscribe to the Lily Revenge Stories channel, like this video, and please hit that hype button to help this story reach even more people.